Hello, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very glad to have you all with us today. Thanks for joining us at a slightly unusual time. We appreciate people have to pay attention to actually the details we send out in email, so thank you for being one of those people. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure that you're chatting to everyone so we can see your comments, and we love to know who's with us in the room. Let us know your name, where you're coming in from. The chat box is also where you can add your questions during the program, and I will try to bring them into our conversation. A few words about JWA for anybody who is new to us. We are a digital archive that works to transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present. And we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story is going to help us make a better world. So thank you for being our partners in this effort. The book talks are just one piece of the work that we do. So we hope that you will go to jwa.org and explore the full range of our resources and our projects and join us for other things too. A quick logistical note, if you would like captioning, you need to turn that on yourself. We can't do it for you, but there's a button at the bottom of your screen that says CC or show captions, and that should make it work. Okay, I am so delighted to introduce Rabbi Dr. Minna Bromberg, who also is a friend, but more importantly for this context, the author of Every Body Beloved, A Jewish Embrace of Fatness. Minna brings her uniquely powerful voice to the urgent work of body liberation within a Jewish context. She is passionate about writing, teaching, and change making at the nexus of social justice and spiritual care. In 2020, she founded Fat Torah with a clear and compelling mission to shatter the idolatry of weight stigma and harness the profound resources of Jewish tradition to build a world that embraces all bodies. Minna is also a gifted singer with 5 acclaimed albums, and she shares that gift by teaching others to lift their voices in song and prayer. Her own unique insights are enriched by her doctoral work in sociology and her rabbinic ordination, and she joins us today from Israel, where she lives with her family. Welcome, Minna. So glad to have you with us.
I'm really grateful to be here and excited.
And it is so fun to get to talk to you now about your book because the last time we spoke for JWA, you were just working on it, just starting work on
Mhm.
it. And we will send people to that podcast interview as well. But it's really exciting to see the book now out in real life. Um, Tell us a little bit about your journey to writing this book.
So I had been doing tiny little bits of writing under the title Fat Torah really since I think the very first thing was probably in 2012. And I also bought the domain name, which of course is an important way of making space for ourselves in the digital world. Um, but it was really in tiny little ways, and I hadn't really in a fuller way I'd been involved in fat activism since the early 1990s, and I was ordained as a rabbi in 2010, but I hadn't really brought them together in a particularly full way in my life. And I was working with rabbinical students in Jerusalem and rabbinical students who were visiting Jerusalem from mostly from North America. And I started realizing that part of the challenge that a lot of my students were facing was just the challenge of being ourselves in public, often in bodies that are marginalized in one way or another, not necessarily fatness, but in other ways. And I think especially for my students who had come from very progressive places where various gender expressions were generally not something that anyone would comment on. And certainly, a woman wearing a yarmulke was not something that anyone would necessarily comment on. And all of a sudden, they're in Jerusalem, where they're supposed to be sort of feeling at home as Jews. And all of a sudden, they're getting, comments on the street about what they look like, what they're wearing, etc. And I realized that as a fat woman, and I'll say more about the word fat in a minute, that I actually had quite a bit of lived experience and learned experience around what it means to be ourselves in public in a marginalized identity. And so that was sort of building in my mind in, I would say, 2018 and 2019, and really wanting to sort of offer some help and support around what it means to just, be ourselves in public. And then I was at a Hanukkah party for my then 3-year-old daughter with all of her preschool, her entire preschool. It was her preschool Hanukkah party in a synagogue. And I'm someone in my own relationship with my body who's generally very comfortable singing, dancing in public, being seen. But at the time, I was 39 weeks pregnant, and I was not feeling very comfortable with the dancing part, which was what we were all supposed to be doing. And my daughter kept saying, "Ema, you have to jump." And I was like, "Oh, honey, that's not that's not going to be happening today." Um, and I realized that I suddenly had this whole inner dialogue going on that I was really sort of not used to at that point because I generally had a positive relation with my body. And so I was sort of surprised that all of a sudden I had all these voices in my head, and one voice would say, "Well, I hope everyone knows I'm pregnant, and that's why I'm not dancing." And then this other voice was like, "That's kind of an ableist thing to say to yourself. Like, why shouldn't anyone be able to show up in any space and move or not move, however they can or want to?" And then, the voices just kept piling on. Why do you think anyone would be judging you? Well, because people are always judging fat bodies, right? This whole inner storm. And then I was very relieved when we stopped dancing to eat sufganiyot, which are Hanukkah jelly donuts. And there we are, munching away. And then the young man who the synagogue had hired to lead the singing and dancing brought us all back into singing and dancing by saying, "All right, let's all get back to dancing unless you got too fat from those sufganiyot." And I was like, "Oh, right. The reason that this whole inner storm was going on is because, in fact, people are always judging fat people in public and private and all other ways." And I was really, first of all, I was hurt because it's always painful. I was also angry that he would say this in front of these 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds when we know that at that age, kids are already starting to judge their own and other people's bodies as good and bad in this very sort of morally freighted way. But then I also felt like, wait a second, doesn't this guy know that when we're eating sufganiyot, when we're celebrating Hanukkah, we're actually celebrating fat as a symbol of our people's endurance in the face of hardship? And what I realized was that, of course, this guy doesn't know this because I'm the one that thinks those things and I haven't been saying them. And so it was really sort of this, like, kind of twig snapping catalyst of a moment where I realized that if I really wanted to be um, bringing more of that fat Torah into the world, that it was really on me to do it. And so I started thinking about what I wanted to write, and the first piece that I wrote to share on social media was all about leaving the house and what it means to leave the house in a marginalized body, and sort of thinking about sort of micro resistance in the face of microaggressions. And it was this whole poem about how I leave the house. And then it was March 2020, and no one was leaving their house at all to go anywhere. And so suddenly there I was with a 4-year-old and a newborn in lockdown, with not really a lot of headspace for writing necessarily, but one of the things that lockdown meant was that all of these communities in the US were looking for online teaching. And because it didn't matter when anyone slept or woke, I could be teaching from my place in Israel, in the States. And I started doing quite a few workshops for synagogues and hillels and things like that. But I still always felt like I wanted to be writing a book. And so I started, thinking about what that structure would be like. I taught a course through Hebrew College, through one of their adult education programs, that was meant to sort of be a course for people who are taking the course, but also as a way for myself of helping me think through sort of how would I chunk things into themes. And one of the people who took that first course, I think, is with us, Rebecca Corey, Dr. Rebecca Corey. She took a Factora course with me and really became kind of a sounding board and a thought partner, and really like a midwife for the book. So she and I would share things that I was writing with her, and she would give me feedback. She was my first reader.
Hmm.
And then came the task of, trying to find a home for the book and deciding, was I going to try to self-publish? Was I going to try to find a traditional publisher? What would that be like? And so I started, sending it off to various places. And And a week after the war started, over 2 years ago, I got a publisher. And so then suddenly I was parenting during wartime and writing a book. And that's kind of that's what I've been up to.
Well, I so appreciate so many of the things that came out, even just in that description of that journey, from the ways in which your ongoing work then had this moment of kind of catalyst of being like, oh, okay, this is a point at which something shifts. And you actually write in the book about having almost this moment of looking around and being like, isn't someone going to say something? And being like, oh, shoot, I guess I'm the person who has to do that, right?
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
think we've all had those moments of sort of something tipping and realizing like we have to step into the work that we may already be doing, but in a really different way.
Yeah.
But also, I think it's so important to think about like who are the partners that make that possible and and even in what you were saying, part of what came out is just like all the analogies and sort of allied relationships that go into this kind of analysis. And I think part of what is so important and challenging about your book is that, of course, fat phobia is one of the most kind of entrenched and therefore invisible and still acceptable in many ways forms of discrimination. So there's so much education and kind of consciousness raising and just making the invisible visible that you have to do again and again in this book, as you do in your work and in your life. Um, and you do such a good job of kind of telling your own story and then putting it in a larger context that makes that possible. One of the things that is one of the kind of frames in your book is you intersperse in the chap between chapters these letters to different people in your life. And I was curious whether you knew that that was always going to be part of it, or was that something that kind of came in as as you were working on it?
That was actually a relatively late addition to the form of the manuscript. Rebecca had convened this sort of circle of first readers once I had a full first draft. And so I had a wonderful four people who were reading, and then we had a chance to be together and talk about it. And one thing that came out was that there was a chapter, originally there was a chapter that was going to be in the form of letters. And the thinking was that the letters were great, but the chapter wasn't really working. And so then I was sort of left with thinking about like, okay, what will I do with that? And I realized that I had been using letters for that chapter in particular, I think because it was a harder chapter, a harder theme. It was the theme around how we talk about fatness and bodies in community and in our own lives. And I think it's one of the harder themes to think about. But I realized that actually each of the chapters could have a letter that was sort of thematically related to it, come right before it. And so that was how that happened. And the letters were created for the book. None of them are letters that I've actually sent to anyone. Um, and they're almost all, there are one or two that are kind of composites, but otherwise they really are, just the one person who I had in mind. And um, and there were actually um, two people who I contacted before the book came out.
Mhm.
Two people who were in the letters that I wanted them to know that that story was gonna show up
Mhm.
before they read it in the book.
Well, there are just so many, I feel like I always learn from you. And there were just certain lines in the book that, just sort of like were these reminders. And some of them are things that I'm sure for someone else might be, I'm sure everyone would have different ones. One of the ones for me that kind of was an important reminder, which is again, not something I didn't know, but something somehow many of us, I think, probably need to hear every day practically. Um, I have a whole list of them, but I'll share one, which was my body is neither an achievement nor a failure, and neither is yours. And I was just like, oh, we need to like put that on a wall or or
Yeah,
something, because
yeah.
the language of how we talk about bodies is so often really caught up in language of work and achievement and struggle and all kinds of things that are built into other systems that we struggle with also.
hmm Yeah, and I think also like I think when people have particular goals for what their body feels like or looks like or measures in a particular way, even if it's like a blood test that they're working on, that they feel like their behavior has some way to impact that blood test. Like, that I don't think there's anything wrong with celebrating when there's something that we're pursuing and then we achieve it. I think there is a problem with sort of assuming that health overall or a particular body type overall is an achievement or a failure. And I think, it's always helpful to me to imagine the flip side, right? So I write about my maternal fetal medicine doctor when I was in my second pregnancy, um, and how proud she was of me that I didn't have gestational diabetes, and she was like so proud. I mean, she was like, I write it in English in the book, but it was in Hebrew in the original, right? Like, "Ani roa shet kol kach mitametzet." Like, I can tell that you're trying so hard, and I was like, I'm not trying it. What are you talking about? And what was so helpful to me about why that was so off-putting to me was to realize that if I had had gestational diabetes, she would definitely have seen it as my own failure.
Failure, right.
And so, yeah,
Right. And it's
I
all
think
these
that,
things are tied up in, sort of questions around individual assumptions about individual agency and that
yeah,
and choice and all kinds of things that are
yeah,
very much wrapped up in politics of bodies and all
yeah.
kinds of things.
I've had a
Um,
few times over the last week where I've just sort of, been in conversation with someone and just sort of burst out with the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism.
right.
With this sort of idea of, work and salvation and yeah, and how the body gets sort of trapped in that.
Right. And there are so many big systems. And then, of course, you're also one of the kind of, I don't know if systems is really the right word, but in some ways, I think that you're embedding your work in is Judaism. And that's why you have this larger frame of Fat Torah.
Hmm.
What are some of the ways that you're using, that you're talking about Judaism and Jewish values and connecting them here to fat liberation?
Yeah, so I want to take sort of a step backward and say that up until I would say the last 5 years or so, most of, like, if you look at certainly the academic world of fat studies and religion, it's almost all about how religion is horribly oppressive in terms of anti-fat bias.
Mhm.
Um, and it's really only recently that there have been people looking at how religion can actually be a liberatory force when we think about bodies. Um, and so I think part of it is that that I think, this would be a much different story if I was someone who experienced my Judaism as an oppressive force in my life. But I've always experienced it as liberatory. Even when I was, a very little kid and who felt quite marginalized and different than my peers. And synagogue was a real refuge for me. Especially the liturgy and the singing were really a place where, Judaism was a place. I think a number of years ago, I recorded some little video for JWA about this actually, um, that for me, I had these ways that I was different. I was this smart, fat Jewish girl in this small town, and but my Jewishness was a piece that had positive content to it, right? So I still felt marginalized as a Jew, but it had such positive content, and I had such a positive and affirming connection with Judaism that it really helped me understand what it meant to. And my Dvar Torah, my sermon for my bat mitzvah was about loving the stranger. And
Mm.
so, even as a 12-year-old, really feeling like my tradition was giving me real strength around what it means to be different and to embody that in ways that could be positive. So those are sort of early memories. And then I think that, like so many other ways of viewing things, that, now I'm someone who, when I read, when I look at a Jewish text, at least part of the lens that I'm looking through is really what I would think of as a Fat Torah lens, right? Like, how can this be a text that can help me think about what it means to, whether it's, recognizing fat people as created in the divine image, um, or, certainly some of the other texts that I bring in the book.
Hmm.
But I think some of that also comes from, I really credit the particular kind of rabbinic training that I got at Hebrew College in terms of really feeling a sense of how important it was to be able to bring our whole selves to the text and to the tradition that we were learning, and to value that, the ways that there could be confluence between that act of sort of uncovering more and more of ourselves as we're uncovering the meaning of texts.
Right. And then also, you then do another step of thinking about if we actually were to live these values, what does that look like, right? So it's like
Yeah.
bringing your own lens so that you can see yourself reflected in the text, and then also thinking about how do we actually see our whole community as reflected in that text.
Yeah.
You know,
I think also, yeah. I think also that so often when people are making claims about why it's important to speak out against anti-fat bias, that so often the claim that they're making is a moral claim.
hmm.
And not that you have to have either religion or religious training to make moral claims, but I think there's something to me that feels different about, being a rabbi making a moral claim than being, say, like an anti-diet dietitian making a moral claim. Like, I'm glad that there are those folks out there using their voices in that way, but it feels powerful to me to be able to bring my theological training and my training in text work to that. That, I think that it, so often what's frustrating is that people are, certainly bringing their moral, like doctors, for example, are bringing their morality into the doctor's office when they're dealing with fat patients. And so what does it mean to actually come from a place to basically be able to say, sort of like, maybe stay in your lane, like you're not actually meant to be engaging in moral education. Like, that is my job, and that's,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah, there were two pieces that just in, for example, in looking at thinking about the concept of Tselem Elohim, of the divine image, you have this one line where you say the divine image does not have problem areas, which I thought was like so beautiful and like a really sharp way of making that point that if we really understand humans as being in the divine image, then whatever we say about human bodies, we're also saying about the divine.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, and then you also have a place where you're talking more about the kind of question of what it means to be a welcoming community. And you say, God's presence cannot fully exist in our midst when that midst has not made room for fat people.
Yeah.
And taking that idea of God's presence and what our relationship is to that more communal level of what does that actually mean? We give so much lip service often in the Jewish community about wanting to be welcoming or making space for people. But actually, when you're talking, this is an example of like literally space. Like, how
Yeah.
do you have enough space for people to walk in aisles, or how do you have
Mm-hmm.
chairs that actually everybody can sit in,
Mm-hmm.
and being able to see those as things that need to be priorities that communities are taking into consideration.
Yeah. 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 And I think, yeah, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say maybe read a little excerpt here because we'd love
Yeah.
to hear some of the text. But if you were going to respond to that point, I don't want to cut you off
No,
from.
I think I'm ready for an excerpt. I
Okay,
think I'm
great.
ready. Okay, so this is from a bit of an advanced chapter. So if it feels like it's going over anyone's head, you'll just have to read the previous chapters and work your way up to it. This is from a chapter that's about desire. And so just to preface it by saying that, so much of my experience as a fat woman is around both being told that I'm overly desiring, right? That I must be eating too much, etc. And also, of course, being viewed as being undesirable. And so really working with this idea of what it means to desire and also to be desired. Desire for fatness sings out of the Song of Songs, which Rabbi Akiva describes as a textual holy of holies, saying the whole world is not as worthy as the day on which the Song of Songs was given to Israel. In this most beloved of biblical songs, filled with verses of two lovers celebrating each other's bodies and overflowing with yearning for one another, we hear this praise of the fat belly in Song of Songs 7:3. Your navel is like a round goblet, let mixed wine not be lacking. Your belly like a heap of wheat hedged about with lilies. I hear in this ancient text an invitation to let our own creative juices flow in finding more and more words to describe the beloved fat body, our own and anyone else's. Loving fat bodies can also call us to a more expansive love, a fattening of desire itself, rejoicing in the diversity of human form. At a meditation retreat I attended some years ago, by the third or fourth day, being in silence with people I did not know was making me feel very exposed and vulnerable in my fatness. I could not rely, as I usually did, on the use of my voice to connect with people and to prove my worth. With words, I could make people laugh, I could impress them, or do whatever I needed to do to convince myself that they liked me. With only my silent body, I was frightened of their presumed rejection. And then, in one otherwise sleepy afternoon meditation session, in which dozens of us sat on our cushions trying to keep our eyes open despite having warm, full bellies after lunch, our meditation teacher suddenly looked up from her own cushion at the front of the room. Her words jolted us upright as she gazed out at us sitting in our many rows and said, "It's like I'm looking at a field of wildflowers." Tears streamed down my face as I returned my attention to my breath, sitting taller now that I had been reminded that I could be seen and appreciated in my uniqueness, and that the wild variety of our bodies made us more and not less beautiful to behold. Our ultimate desire is the desire for life itself. We can learn what it means to love our bodies from traditions surrounding the reluctance of the soul to leave the body at the moment of death. Moses' soul was so resistant to the idea of leaving a body that she had epically journeyed with for 120 years that she rebuffed the angel of death, who was sent to separate her from Moses' physical form. Finally, God's self had to go and kiss Moses on the mouth so that his soul could go right from Moses back to God with no angelic intermediary. The Zohar also describes how difficult it is for the soul to leave the body in death. Quoting a verse from the Song of Songs, "For love is fierce as death," this central text of Jewish mysticism imagines, "For love is fierce as fierce as separation of spirit from body. We have learned when a human is about to depart from the world, the spirit moves through each member of the body like a boatman without oars who is tossed up and down on the sea and makes no progress. It then asks leave of each limb, and its separation is only effected with great violence. I aspire to love my own fat body with just this fierceness, not because it is especially virtuous or is better or worse than any other body. I do not need to argue for or even prefer to have a fat body in order to desire to live as fully as I can in the only body that I have, the only life that I have. I offer this blessing. May I cling to this beloved body ferociously, letting its roaring desires continue to lead me, in honor of the journey we have already been on together, and with the hope of many more roads to come.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Um, and I think that that theme of desire is one of the really moving and challenging parts of your book because um, it is such a, it is one of the clear ways that diet culture perverts our experience of ourselves. Um, and it also connects to all these other uh, kind of forces within and stereotypes of Jewish culture, of women. I was thinking about you talk in that chapter about nourishing ourselves and others as a divine act, as something that is how God is described. Um, and it made me think about the kind of great ambivalence that we have around Jewish women and the act of nourishing, right? That we both love and resent. Jewish women are both loved and resented for sort of pushing food in various ways.
Hmm.
And the ways in which we take that ambivalence that we may have about our own desires and we project it onto other people and punish them for whether they express their desires or whether they don't express their desires, or the ways that they try to fulfill other people's desires or not fulfill other people's desires, and how complicated that becomes.
Oh, I think it's incredibly complicated. And I think this whole idea also of, um, that desire is also so much about choosing. And there's I saw, on the same day that I saw it in Tel Aviv and a friend of mine saw in Haifa, these new billboards that have like this very sort of muscle, like bodybuilder guy on the billboard, and the text of the billboard is being fat a choice? And I have no idea who's behind the billboard.
What is it a billboard for?
No idea. No idea. But just the sense that like, right, as if like either it's saying like being fat isn't a choice, and so take our medicine or do our thing that will help you not be fat, or is it saying like who would ever choose to be, fat? Either way, it was a disturbing thing for me and my fat activist friend who sent me the picture from Haifa to see. And it made me realize that so much of this is about, like the way that we try to make ourselves acceptable by proving that it's not a choice, right? That we would
Mhm.
change it if we could. And I'm so reminded of, like the stuff like in the 90s around like searching for the gay gene, right? That like
Right,
if only we could prove, right? That like, that we love who we love because we can't help it and it's just how we were born. And the way that that whole idea of sort of, you should accept me because I was born this way and there's nothing I can do about it is reinforcing the idea that it would be better to not be this way,
right, right. Yeah,
as opposed to like a much more, complex idea about what it means to want something or to not want something.
yeah. Um, I wanted to ask you, and this relates to that, about the relationship of fat liberation to other movements. You talk in the book about being in college inspired by gay friends who kind of were able to fully inhabit their identity in a way that you were yearning to. Certainly, you talk about the impact of feminism on fat liberation. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's definitely, you know, if you look at, for example, the Fat Liberation Manifesto that was written in 1973, there's all by Jewish women who weren't claiming their Jewishness at the time explicitly, but that's who they were. Um, and they were part of a group called the Fat Underground that was already like a feminist breakaway from NAFA, which was the National Association to Advance Fat Acceptance. So already there was a sense of sort of what the role of feminism is in fat liberation. And also, if I'm remembering correctly, they're pretty explicit in the Fat Liberation Manifesto about the ways that oppression of fat people is tied in with racism and classism. So those are sort of already there, like it's kind of baked in. And I feel like um, more and more, certainly the connections between like anti-fat bias and anti-Black racism in the US have been much more, have become much more made explicit. There's a book called Fearing the Black Body that came out. Oh, I'm forgetting the year, but it must have been maybe 2016 or 2017. That was written by a sociologist that really looks at the way that anti-fatness in the U.S. is very much connected with anti-Blackness, and certainly also, looking at the ways um, that disability justice and fat liberation are really tied in with each other. This whole question of like, is fatness a disability, raises all kinds of interesting questions about health and illness and what are the sort of pros and cons of framing fatness as a disability, and a lot of different voices around that. Um, I will say that what this has meant in certainly in the last 2 years, I think, the desire for solidarity across movements, Also can obviously make strange bedfellows and can also sometimes kind of strain logic and I think lead to and or come out of a real sort of groupthink. And so one of the things that I've been thinking about and writing about a lot and hope to be doing more of more publicly soon is that also about, like by November of 2023, it was clear that the sort of organized radical fat liberation movement in the US was pretty clear that fat liberation was Palestinian liberation, by which they meant not condemning Hamas. Um, and um, and so that question of sort of is fat liberation Palestinian liberation, or what does my relationship with my body have to do with my relationship with this land is really sort of that's my next project that I'm
Mhm.
working on. Is sort of taking not being, not just sort of being dismissive of that um, desire to make some connection between fat liberation and Palestinian liberation, but really saying like, what do these things have to do with each other?
Right. No, it is really a complicated question around the kind of, you write so beautifully in the book. I think it comes out of the book sort of how these issues play out in the most personal ways and in the most global ways.
Hmm.
And also, as you said, there's all kinds of issues of allyship and political connections. And then what does that actually look like in our lived lives? And the complicated ways that plays out is real.
Yeah.
And I'm excited for you to help guide us through that. We'll look forward to having you back to talk about that.
Yeah.
Um, I want to get to some of the questions in the chat, which are really important questions, and some really speak to some of the recommendations you make in your book. So, for example, one of the things that you say in your book is like, if you are looking for a place to start, one of the most basic ways is not to compliment people on weight loss. And in fact, Sarah in the chat has asked, like, people sometimes comment on my body, which I don't really appreciate, and say, have you lost weight? And what is the best response to that kind of comment?
Yeah, so I think that there's a couple things going on here. One is this whole question of how to deal on a communal level with, or on a cultural level with the practice of complementing weight loss. I think in the moment when I am often hesitant, there's this whole question of self-advocacy, right?
Hmm.
And what it means to advocate for ourselves, which I think can be very powerful, but I also think that it can sort of set ourselves up to feel like we're not being a good enough self-advocate if we don't have like the snappiest comment right in the moment. And so I think we can think, and I'm sure other folks in the chat also have ideas about sort of how to respond to that, but I just want to give ourselves also the permission to not feel like it's on us to sort of change the world in that moment when we are receiving unwanted attention.
Hmm.
And I think it's also um, in situations where there's a real power dynamic, there's all this sort of emphasis on self-advocacy, but if you're in a place where you're really in a position with less power, it's not clear that self-advocacy actually gets you better outcomes.
Right.
Right. So in a doctor's office, or, if it's a, professor complimenting you and your student, right, we can think of all kinds of settings where self-advocacy is not necessarily going to lead to a better outcome. That being said, I think one option um, is to ignore it and move on to the next comment, which I think can be really challenging for us in social situations, right? We're so trained, and certainly women are trained. Like if someone says something, someone compliments me, I need to say something back. Um, and so it can be really powerful to just change the subject.
Hmm.
And I think you can also just be very direct and say, I don't like people commenting on my body.
Right.
And that sort of makes it about boundaries and comments on the body as opposed to whether weight loss is good or bad.
Hmm.
Um, and what I often say when people ask me if I've lost weight, which is also just the truth, is I don't know. I don't weigh myself.
Hmm.
Which is also sort of like a little shock off into the system because they're like, what? How
Right.
is that possible? But it does have the benefit of being true. So those are some ideas about, in the moment responses. And the general idea about not complimenting weight loss um, is that we really don't know what it is that we're complimenting. Um, people could be losing weight because they're dealing with grief or dealing with some kind of disease process that causes weight loss, unwanted weight loss. Um, they could actually have an eating disorder, which you're then like supporting by complimenting their weight loss. And you're also sending the message to them and to everyone else in earshot that you think that it's better to be thin than to be fat as an overall moral judgment. And so those are the reasons that I feel like shifting the culture around complimenting weight loss is definitely something that I think is one of the single best things we can do to shift
Yeah.
how we talk about bodies.
And that connects to one of the other themes that you have a whole chapter on, which is dealing with that question of, but what about your health?
Hmm.
What
Yeah.
can you talk a little about your approach to that question, which
Yeah.
also kind of came up a little in the chat?
Sure. So, um, I think that fat people as a group are at higher risk of certain diseases than our thin counterparts, and at lower risk of other diseases, which most people don't talk about very much. Um, and I think we have a tendency to confuse risk with causation. So that's one piece that it's not clear for most of the things that fat people are at higher risk for. It's not clear that fat is causing that risk to be elevated. But I think that, and there is, I think someone in this chat mentioned health at every size.
Hmm.
There's a lot of wonderful work being done by doctors and dietitians and nurses and all kinds of other medical and mental health professionals around health at every size. And people can certainly look up more on that if they're interested in sort of from the medical science point of view. Because I love science and medicine, and because I'm a medical sociologist by training, I can sometimes get a little sidelined into like, no, here are the statistics, which I think are fascinating and people should look them up. But I think from my perspective as a rabbi, the real issue is more around, how do we treat people who are at higher risk of certain diseases? Because we ought to be treating them with better and more compassionate care, um, rather than blaming them um, and making it seem like they're a failure because of their increased risk, right? When we think of other things that people are at increased risk for, if they are not in a stigmatized social category, then we tend to view that increased risk as something that's worthy of attention and care, and not something that's worthy of blame and denigration.
Hmm. Yeah. There was a question also about the idea of body positivity versus body neutrality and how you think about
Mm,
that. And I think maybe we can use that also to talk about language in general, because I think there was another question about use of the word fat, which you had mentioned at the beginning, but then
yeah.
we didn't actually
We
get to.
never talked about it. So using the word fat to describe my own body is something that when I became involved in the fat acceptance movement in the early 1990s, I was joining a movement that had been around in an organized form in the US since the late 60s. And for me, one of the most powerful points of that movement is to reclaim the word fat as a morally neutral and accurate description of a particular kind of human body in the vast diversity of human forms. And so like partly it's that just like any other word that has been used as a slur, folks who are members of the group that's being marginalized in that way can reclaim the term as a way of sort of taking the sting out of the slur. So you can think about the way that Jews have reclaimed the term Jew, or that, so much of the language in the world of LGBTQ has been, a real sort of reclaiming of words that were used to denigrate people in the past and still sometimes today. And so that's on the use of the word fat. And I also feel like once it's something we can use morally neutrally, it's also just such an accurate word. So I tend not to be a fan of euphemism, although, of course, people can describe their own bodies however they want. But I tell this story in the book about going to my daughter's kindergarten. I was invited to come to a meeting with her and one of her teachers to look at, some of what she was learning. And so I'm, sitting on the tiny chair participating in this activity. And the activity was that the teacher would that one of the players would put two cards in front of the other player, and each card would have a picture on it, a different picture, and then the person had to close their eyes, and whoever put the cards down would flip over one of the cards, and then you open your eyes and you say, which card was flipped and what the difference is. And so my daughter puts down in front of me a card with a picture of a chicken and a card with a picture of a tree, and I close my eyes, and when I open my eyes, she's flipped over the picture of a chicken, and it's a fatter chicken on the other side. And so I say, "Oh, that chicken's fatter, and before it was thinner." And her teacher was like, like, oh, what do I say? And I think sometimes, especially when I'm speaking Hebrew, where people like assume that it's a problem with my Hebrew,
Right.
right? So she was like, "Yes, that chicken is bigger." And I was like, but bigger isn't as accurate as saying fatter, right? Like it wasn't a taller chicken. It wasn't like a larger breed of chicken. It was the same chicken that was fatter. And so some of it is also just sort of not just, like also reclaiming sort of the simple accuracy of the word. So that's
Hmm.
around fat. Um, the term body positivity, um, I think um, first started being used, I guess, about 20 years ago, and has really been part of sort of in online spaces, especially um, people wanting to be, more positive about bodies. And I think that one thing, and you can already hear in it, right, that it shies away from the word fat, or shies away from sort of a particular from saying it's about a particular body size. And in fact, people use body positivity to talk about all kinds of body diversity, not just fatness. But I think that some people have felt that body positivity is versus body neutrality, that it's sort of like asking us to feel good about the body that we have.
Mm.
Um, and um, and we don't actually have to feel good about our bodies to think that we should get equal treatment with other human beings. And I think some people feel like body positivity puts sort of too high a bar. Like you have to love yourself. Like what, that's, I mean, loving our bodies and enjoying being in our bodies, I think is a wonderful result of all kinds of things potentially. But the idea that the goal is to sort of have everyone love their bodies, as opposed to the goal being to have us as a society and as a culture find ways to treat all bodies with kindness and compassion, is a very different goal. So I think that the use of the term body neutrality was around trying to sort of take away that pressure to love yourself when like maybe you're just not, that's just not there for you.
Right. Or just probably isn't achievable for any human all the time.
Right. And I think also, like, I think another problem with body positivity is that it assumes that like body positivity, I think I say this somewhere in the book that, the body positive, like feeling good about my body has never actually resulted in more competent medical care.
Right.
Like I've never manifested a comfortable seat by feeling good about myself.
Right.
So it can also sort of make it seem as if like that's the change we need. And it's like, actually, I just want to be able to sit down.
Yeah. Yeah, and helping people sort of also just understand. You have a beautiful piece where you talk about the story, the biblical story of the spies going to check out the promised land and coming
Yeah.
back and seeing themselves as grasshoppers and saying we can't do this. And you talk about that story as, they can feel however they feel, but it's like it's how you choose to speak about things. That first of all,
Hmm.
that's something we have maybe more control over than how we feel about something. But also, it's the thing that has the public impact. Um,
Hmm.
and that was, I thought that was a really powerful way to make clear the difference between how you might feel and the impact difference in impact between how you might feel about something and what you say about it.
Right, right. I mean, I my 5-year-old loves buses and would love to. It's really hard for him that he's not yet allowed to ride a bus by himself. And there was a while there for a few months. He hasn't done it recently. There was a while for a few months where we would be at a bus stop and he would say, "Ema, I'm thinking something." And I would say, "What are you thinking?" And he would say, "I'm thinking about getting on a bus by myself." And like it was actually this wonderful opportunity to talk about like the difference between thought and action. Like you
Yeah.
are allowed to think about getting on a bus by yourself all you want. Like you're allowed to fantasize about it, you're allowed to dream about it, you're allowed to really want that. You are not allowed to do that thing. And so I think when we think about sort of that line also between thoughts or feelings and speech, it's that same kind of thing. Like think like whatever any thought or desire or feeling that you have is totally valid. And if it's one that you don't want and you want help changing it, fine, but like you shouldn't feel like you need to police that part of your life. But our speech is something that we can actually hopefully have more control over.
Yeah. There is a more rabbinic question from Rachel Nussbaum, asking if you could share a favorite piece of Torah or two that you regularly turn to to teach Fat Torah.
Yeah. Well, one that I was actually so definitely the whole idea of what it means to be created in the divine image has become kind of a real core teaching for me. And um, and particularly the way that, and this is something that I learned first from Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, the way that the use of the idea of humans as creating the divine image is used in Mishnah and in Talmud to warn the witnesses in death penalty cases, right? So we can imagine that a witness in a death penalty case is someone who literally has another human being's life in their hands. And so the rabbis use this as a way to sort of riff on, well, what does it mean? What is a human life? And what does it mean to have power over that human life? And there are beautiful teachings in there. And one of the favorites for me certainly is this image of God's greatness being expressed through the diversity of human bodies. And so the midrash, the teaching that's offered there is that we can imagine that when a human, let's say a human king or emperor or whoever, wants to stamp out coins with his image on them, he stamps out the coins and every single one of them is identical. And that God imprints each of us with the divine image and each of us looks different. And that's really seen as a sign of God's greatness. And so I love this idea. And I think we tend to sort of spiritualize it and think that being created in the divine image means that we each have like a unique soul or something like that, right? Or that our soul is divine. And what I love about this midrash is that it's really saying like that it literally says, each of them looks different, right? That the diversity of human form um, is a sign of the divine in the world.
Can you say a tiny bit about your work as a voice coach and how it's connected to your Fat Torah work overall?
Yeah, I just wrote about this in my newsletter actually because I got this question from a rabbinical student. So if you want to read that take on it, you can sign up for the newsletter. Um,
Which
and
I highly
um,
recommend. It's great.
yeah, what I realized, it actually came from um, a friend and a voice student who I really had a real rupture in my relationship with her after I started Fat Torah, where she just couldn't imagine why I would use the word fat in something that wasn't a negative thing to be gotten away from. Um, and I was so taken aback because I felt like every time we had a voice lesson together and I talked about starting where you are and being willing to be with the voice as it is and letting the belly be soft to make space for the breath, that for me, that was all infused with my sense, with what fat acceptance has meant for me. And that I realized that I wasn't sort of conveying that explicitly, or that either that I wasn't conveying it explicitly or that she just wasn't picking it up was so interesting to me, right? That the whole time I think that these two things are completely consonant. Um, and so I think a lot of it is around the fact that most students who come to me for voice work are coming because there's something they don't like about the way they sing, or there's something they want help with, or something they want to improve. And we do that, but it's important to me, and to me, this is just an important part of my approach to voice work, that we have to start with actually hearing the voice where it is, and actually experiencing the voice where it is, and learning how to work with the voice that we have and not some other voice that we wish that we had. That I think that often when there's sort of this spoken or unspoken desire to, have shown up with a different voice.
Hmm.
And, I can help you work with what you've got, but I can't actually help you have a different voice than the voice that you have. Um, and um, and I can hopefully give a lot more freedom with the voice that you have. Um, but that um, but that if we're not able to accept the voice as it is, and certainly the voice is absolutely about sort of making space in the body for the voice to come through. So if we can't accept the voice and the body as they are, it's actually going to be a lot harder to make improvements that we might want to make.
Hmm. I hadn't thought about it that way. That's beautiful. I hope everybody's going to buy your book. My last question is might seem like a silly question, but I was really intrigued by the shape of your book, which definitely stands out as I've never seen such like a nice square, like chunky shaped book.
Yeah.
And it was really kind of fun to hold and read. And I was curious if you chose that specifically and what kind of the thought process was around that.
Yeah, so I got to the end of writing and didn't feel like I had any more words to add, and realized that the book was not very long, like not a lot of words, and that if it were published in a more traditional format, it would be a very thin book. And I love thinness as much as I love fatness. Nothing wrong with being thin, but I realized that like I had this opportunity to be like, no, I actually want a fat book. And so the shape of it was chosen so that it would be a thicker book. And it's been really actually sweet to sort of see how it lets people, that for me, it really means that when people are holding the book, that they're really practicing embracing fatness. And I love the fact that, that I think especially when so much of what we consume these days is online and not in sort of physical form, that like to have something that you're choosing to put in physical form in a way that lets people practice embracing fatness in the world felt like a really wonderful opportunity, and I love the way it turned out.
Yeah, it is very satisfying to hold. And it stands out, which is also really
Hmm.
nice to sort of have it be something that has its own distinct look and looks
Yeah.
different on the shelf.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much, Minna, for writing this book, for being with us today, for your leadership on this issue, for teaching us so much. And thanks to everyone who joined us today and for your comments and questions. There is always more to discover at JWA. We'll put some links in the chat. As I mentioned earlier, I did an interview with Minna a few years ago for our podcast, which covered some similar ground, but also some other topics. So I encourage you to listen to it. I pulled a piece out of our encyclopedia about another Jewish fat liberation activist, Alana Dykewoman, who was a pioneer. Um, there is a lovely piece written by one of our Teen Rising Voices fellows about Jewishness, body image, and fat liberation. And she actually mentions Minna at the end of it, which I thought was great. It's nice to see different generations learning from one another. And then also, Minna, you mentioned the piece that you wrote for us a few years ago for our Reimagining Rabbis series about loving the stranger within. And so we'll put that there too.
Great.
And the links will be when we send out the recording tomorrow. I put those in the box that on YouTube that's underneath the video. So if people are looking to get the links, if it's too hard to get them from the chat, you can look for it there. Please join us next week. We'll be back at our usual 8 p.m. Eastern time slot, which I know is not great for people who are in Europe or Israel. So I apologize for that. But we do always record, so you can follow us after. Next week, we'll be having a conversation with Sarah Hurwitz about her new book, As a Jew, Reclaiming Our Story from Those Who Blame, Shame, and Try to Erase Us. And again, thank you, everyone. Until next time, take care and let's take care of each other. Have a great day.
Thanks so much. Bye, everyone.